Hi everyone, this is Jeff Murray. Thanks for joining me again for this final installment of our discussion of Beowulf and looking into Seamus Heaney's translation of the ancient text. All right, I'm going to begin on page 151. And if you remember, we know that King Hylek has died and Beowulf has taken over, and he has ruled for 50 years as the king of Geatland. And things seem to be going pretty swell, but what happens is we realize that, as we left yesterday, that there is a dragon on the prowl. And so what we're going to do is we're going to sink into this dragon story. And when my students have read this, they say to themselves often, wow, this is very familiar. This reeks of a lot of the images and a lot of the things in here are very similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's works. And of course, that's by his own design. Tolkien loved this book. He was one of the greatest scholars who lectured extensively on it, sort of brought it into the academic limelight, as it were. So it was, a lot of his work could be considered to be an homage to this particular work here. All right, so let's dig in and let's take a look at this dragon story. All right, so as I mentioned there, it's on I'm going to start 22, 12. Where it says a dragon on the prowl from the deep vaults of a stone-roofed barrow where he guarded a hoard, where there was a hidden passage unknown to men, but someone managed to enter by it and interfere with the heathen trove. So what we have is the dragon has his lair, all right? And it is a lair that has riches. That's his hoard that he has there. It's not one that someone would find. It's not easily detectable, but we'll see who in just a second has somehow inadvertently stumbled upon this place, and the person will see all of the riches that are in this particular lair. All right, so let's continue on. He had handled and removed a gem-studded goblet, so this person stole something from the dragon's hoard. It gained him nothing, though, with a thief's wiles. He had outwitted the sleeping dragon that drove him into rage, as the people of that country would soon discover. So this person who discovers the lair and discovers the hoard, pretty daring if you ask me, goes and sneaks and steals like a jewel-encrusted goblet, kind of from right beside a sleeping dragon. So when the dragon wakes up, the dragon looks around and says, something's missing. All right? And that puts him into a rage. All right? And it says here that the people will soon discover. All right. So it says, the intruder who broached the dragon's treasure, and moved him to wrath had never meant to. It was desperation on the part of a slave, fleeing the heavy hand of some master, guilt-ridden and on the run, going to ground. All right, so this was a person who was just looking for a place to hide. He had a slave master that was so cruel to him, and he had fled, and he was on the run and on the lam, looking for some place to hide. And the place he finds to hide just so happens to be a dragon's lair that's filled with treasure. All right. So, page 153 kind of goes into a little bit of detail that the dragon, had assumed possession of these riches, and these riches were leftovers from a race or a group of people who had long since gone. All right, maybe the people were eradicated by war or just by dying out of some kind, but it gives the sense that their civilization was somehow covered over. All of the riches therein it. The dragon discovered that and kind of claimed it to be his own. All right. So let's see here. On page 155. All right. about, let's say 2275. It says, the people on the farms are in dread of him, the dragon. He is driven to hunt out hordes underground to guard heathen gold through age-long vigils, though to little avail. For 3 centuries, this scourge of the people had stood guard on that stoutly protected underground treasury until the intruder unleashed its fury. He hurried to his lord. This is the person who stole the goblet in the first place. He hurried to his lord with a gold-plated cup and made his plea to be reinstated. Then the vault was rifled, the ring hoard robbed, and the wretched man had his request granted. His master gazed on that fine from the past for the first time. All right. So now, this person who was on the run went back and said, hey, look, master. All right. Even though he's on the run, it's like, I'm either running from you or there's a dragon. All right. I'm going to give you this goblet and say, hey, there's more where that came from. And so now they've all gone in and sort of like trying to get as much of this dragon's treasure as possible, which is going to make his anger even more. All right. So we see that all of this is just angering the dragon, compiling his anger, making him even more bitter than he ever had been before. On page 157, line 2312, it says, the dragon began to belch out flames and burn bright homesteads. There was a hot glow that scared everyone, for the vile sky-winger would leave nothing alive in its wake. So just massive destruction, all right? So the last 2 lines of that page. Then Beowulf was given bad news, a hard truth. His own home, the best of buildings, had been burnt to a cinder, the throne room of the Geats. It threw the hero into deep anguish and darkened his mood. The wise man thought he must have thwarted ancient ordinance of the eternal Lord, broken his commandment. Okay, so the idea is they messed with the dragon's stuff, and that sent the dragon into a rage. And in this rage, where he's just indiscriminately going crazy, burning whatever he can get, not I'm saying get his hands on, don't have to get his hands on anything, but just burning everything in front of him, one of the things he destroys is Beowulf's own home. So now, what was personal once for the dragon has now become personal also for Beowulf. All right, so that's the balance that they're keeping there. All right. But it says there on 2342, line 2342, it says, he was destined to face the end of his days in this mortal world, as was the dragon for all his long leasehold on the treasure. All right, so right here we're getting a sense that this battle that Beowulf is going to embark on against this dragon is going to be his last battle. But he's going to take the dragon down along with him. All right. And so for the next few pages, what we see is, pride, Beowulf's pride, all his accomplishments and everything he's done, which kind of, gives us a sense that he has the will and the strength to be able to carry this out. And it even talks about how he became king. It was a difficult thing for him necessarily to do, this implies, because he had a hard time assuming the same responsibilities as he was such a loyal servant, if you will, of Hylic, that it was difficult for him to try to consider himself on the same level as King Hylic. One of the few times we see maybe some humility on Beowulf's part. We see on page 163 that the first part of that second break right there where it says, and so the son of Esthio had survived every extreme, excelling himself in daring and in danger until the day arrived when he had come face to face with the dragon. The Lord of the Geats took 11 comrades. Okay, so he's going to take people and determine who's going to do what, but really people aren't going to be able to they're not going to have the guts to do whatever he's going to do, and he'll end up taking on this dragon all by himself. Page 165, this is one of the most interesting, the writing here I think is very interesting, the way it's, Seamus Heaney decided to translate this. It's on line 2420. It says, sensing his death, his fate hovered near, unknowable but certain. It would soon claim his coffered soul, part life from limb, and before long the prince's spirit would spin free from his body. The way that says that his spirit would spin free from his body. It would then, the earthly would be here and the soul almost would be released in its own way. All right? And we have some recollection of some early days for his people. It's almost like he's taking this one last stroll down memory lane in a lot of these pages here, where let me reminisce on how I became king. Let me reminisce on how, some of the ways we spent in court. Let me reminisce on how I even took care of Grendel and Grendel's mom. There is all this sort of like one last look over my accomplishments before it's all over. All right. At the bottom of page 169, though, it says, Beowulf spoke and made a formal boast for the last time. I risked my life, often when I was young. Now I'm old, but as king of the people, I shall pursue this fight for glory of winning, if the evil one will only abandon his earth fort and face me in the open. Skipping about 3 lines. I would rather not use a weapon if I knew another way to grapple with the dragon and make good my boast, as I did against Grendel in days gone by. But I shall be meeting molten venom in the fire he breathes. So I go forth in mail, shirt, and shield. Almost like I would love to fight him hand to hand, but if we think about it, he's going to be breathing fire at me, so I'm going to take some more precautions than I did before. All right? I won't shift a foot when I meet the cave guard. What occurs on the wall between the two of us will turn out as fate, overseer of men, decides. I am resolved. I scorn further words against the skyborn foe. All right. We see on the next page, 173, line 25-50, where it says, Then he gave a shout. The Lord of the Geats unburdened his breast and broke out in a storm of anger. Skipping 2 lines. He was ignited. I think that's an interesting term. We have a dragon here, breathing fire everywhere. He says, I'm going to take precautions more than I had before because of the molten venom that's going to come. And then the way Heaney chooses his words here, he says, he gave a shout and unburdened himself. He was ignited. All right. And I think it's interesting that he uses that term, because that term to me implies that there is going to be an equal match here between our Beowulf and this dragon. All right. We found that other creatures were not an even match, but we've got the fire-breathing dragon and this ignited Beowulf. All right. The horde guard recognized a human voice. The time was over for peace and parleying. Pouring forth in a hot battle fume, the breath of the monster burst from the rock. There was a rumble underground. Down there in the barrow, Beowulf the warrior lifted his shield. The outlandish thing writhed and convulsed and viciously turned on the king, whose keen-edged sword, an heirloom inherited by ancient right, was already in his hand. Roused to a fury, each antagonist struck terror in the other. Kind of another idea to show us that we got an even match on our hands. Skipping 3 lines. Swaddled in flames, it came gliding and flexing and racing towards its fate. Yet his shield defended the renowned leader's life and limb for a shorter time than he meant to. I think that's kind of a funny way of putting it. That his shield defended him for a shorter time than it meant to. Like, this thing is really not a whole lot against a fire-breathing dragon. That final day was the first time when Beowulf fought, and fate denied him glory in battle. So the king of the Geats raised his hand and struck hard at the enameled scales, but scarcely cut through. The blade flashed and slashed, yet the blow was far less powerful than the hard-pressed king had need of at that moment. The mound keeper went into a spasm and spouted deadly flames when he felt the stroke. Battle fire billowed and spewed. Beowulf was foiled of a glorious victory. The glittering sword, infallible before that day, failed when he unsheathed it as it never should have. For the son of Ecgtheow, it was no easy thing to have to give ground like that and go unwillingly to inhabit another home in a place beyond, so every man must yield the leasehold of his days. All right, so the shield's not working for him. He unsheaths his sword, and it's not working either. All right, this dragon is tough business. But of course it is. It's a dragon. All right. We're introduced on page 175 to a character named Wiglaf here. All right. And Wiglaf is, I would say that Wiglaf is essentially Beowulf's Eshere. All right. He is to Beowulf what Eshere was to Hrothgar. All right. A younger person, but somebody who is fiercely loyal. We get the sense, though, that maybe Beowulf does not have to rely on a right-hand man as much as maybe Hrothgar felt that he needed to rely on a right-hand man. But he has a very loyal subject here in Wiglaf, all right? And it says here at the next to the last break, about 26:26, line 26:26 on page 177, it says, and now the youth was to enter the line of battle with his lord. His first time to be tested as a fighter. First time you're going to be tested as a fighter, and it's against a dragon. Trial by fire, as they say, right? His spirit did not break, and the ancestral blade would keep its edge, as the dragon discovered as soon as they came together in combat. All right. So, skipping a line, it says, Wiglaf spoke wise and fluent words. I remember that time when mead was flowing, how we pledged loyalty to our lord in the hall. Promised our ring giver we would be worth our price, make good the gift of the war gear, those swords and helmets, as and when his need required it. Okay, skipping down now skipping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines. It says, now the day has come when this Lord we serve needs sound men to give him their support. Let us go to him. Help our leader through the hot flame and dread of fire. As God is my witness, I would rather my body were robed in the same burning blaze as my gold giver's body than go back home bearing arms. Skipping down to the last 5 lines of page 179, it says, go on, dear Beowulf. He's speaking directly to him now. Go on, dear Beowulf. Do everything you said you would when you were still young and vowed you would never let your name and fame be dimmed while you lived. Your deeds are famous. So stay resolute, my lord. Defend your life now with the whole of your strength. I shall stand by you. All right. The dragon attacks again just as soon as Wiglaf finishes saying that. And then on line 2678, it says, the war king knew his whole strength. The war king threw his whole strength behind a sword stroke and connected with the skull. And Negling snapped. Negling, apparently, is the name of Beowulf's sword. Remember, Hrunting was the name of the sword that Unferth gave him? Well, Negling is the name of his very own sword. It says, and Negling snapped. Beowulf's ancient iron gray sword let him down in the fight. It was never his fortune to be helped in combat by the cutting edge of weapons made of iron. That was never really what it was meant for, Beowulf. Beowulf's always been a hand-to-hand type of person, so they say. All right, we know he took down Grendel's mom with a sword. He's been fighting here, and keep watching what happens as this dragon thing unfolds. But anyway, When he wielded a sword, no matter how bloodied and hard-edged the blade, his hand was too strong. The stroke he dealt, I have heard, would ruin it. He could reap no advantage. So what this is saying here is that Beowulf was so strong that whenever he would just have such power wielding his blade from side to side, whenever it made contact, the blade just broke under his massive strength. So it would do better just to fight with his hands, because his hands are what do all the damage. They even damage the sword that's in his hands that he's trying to use. All right. Continuing on. It says, then the bane of that people, the fire-breathing dragon, was mad to attack for a third time. When a chance came, he caught the hero in a rush of flame and clamped sharp fangs into his neck. Beowulf's body ran wet with his lifeblood. It came welling out. All right, so he's been struck a significant blow, Beowulf has. All right, on page 183. That first section, that first break there, it says, once again the king gathered his strength and drew a stabbing knife. This is a blade, is it not? Okay. Drew a stabbing knife he carried on his belt, sharpened for battle. He stuck it deep into the dragon's flank. Beowulf dealt it a deadly wound. They had killed the enemy. Courage quelled his life. That pair of kinsmen, partners in nobility, he and Wiglaf, had destroyed the foe. So every man should act, be at hand when needed. But for now, for the king, this would be the last of his many labors and triumphs in the world. Then the wound, dealt by the ground burner earlier, began to scald and swell. Beowulf discovered deadly poison separating inside of him, surges of nausea, and so, in his wisdom, the prince realized his state and struggled towards a seat on the rampart. And what we see after that is Wiglaf attends to him. All right, he's trying to do his best, either, it seems, at times, to try to do his best to bring Beowulf back, or at least to make Beowulf as comfortable as he can as the poison runs its course and as Beowulf deals with the blow that the dragon has dealt him. All right. Page 185, that first section there says, now is the time when I would have wanted to bestow this armor on my own son. Had it been my fortune to have fathered an heir and live on in his flesh. For 50 years I ruled this nation. No king of any neighboring clan would dare face me with troops. None had the power to intimidate me. I took what came, cared for and stood by things in my keeping. Never fomented quarrels, never swore to a lie, and all this consoles me. I can look back on the way I ruled and be proud of my accomplishments. And since I've been ruler, no other leader of any other people has stepped up to try to challenge me. They were all too scared of me given my accomplishments. All right? Skipping down to 2747, somewhere around that line, 2747, it says, I want to examine that ancient gold. Gaze my fill on those garnered jewels. My going will be easier for having seen the treasure. A less troubled letting go of the life and lordship I have long maintained. Just like, let me see. I mean, I fought the dragon because the dragon was destroying people and farms and, houses. There was no other option. But also there is this gold that I get as a result. So I want to take a look at it. I want to see what I just fought for, all right? And so Wiglaf goes down and he enters into the barrow and sees everything. And it's even described there as some of it being so, the gold being so brilliant that it's almost like it shines its own light in the darkness. And he sees all of the magnificent stuff that's there. The bottom of page 187. Wiglaf went quickly, keen to get back, excited by the treasure. Anxiety weighed on his brave heart. He was hoping he would find the leader of the Geats alive where he had left him, helpless, earlier on the open ground. So he came to the place, carrying the treasure, and found his lord bleeding profusely, his life at an end. Again he began to swab his body. The beginnings of an utterance broke out from the king's breast cage, and the old lord gazed sadly at the gold. To the everlasting Lord of all, to the King of glory, I give thanks that I behold this treasure here in front of me, that I have been allowed to leave my people so well endowed on the day I die. Although I'm going to be gone, all of these riches will be for my people, putting them in a better financial spot, I guess, than they were before. Skipping about 4 lines, he requests his dying request. It says, construct a barrow, a monument, if you will, on a headland on the coast after my pyre has cooled. It will loom on the horizon at Hron's Nest and be a reminder among my people, so that in coming times crews under sail will call it Beowulf's Barrow, as they steer ships across the wide and shrouded waters. All right, so leave a monument and leave it out there where people can see. So as people pass by, they can say, yes, I remember that great ruler, that great warrior and ruler who did so much for his kingdom and even for the Danes. All right. The bottom of page 191 says, before long, the battle dodgers abandoned the wood, the ones who had let down their lord earlier, the tail turners, 10 of them together. All right. The people that Beowulf had tried to assemble some people to go, they wouldn't. They were too terrified. They ran to the woods. Wiglaf was the one who stood by him that whole time. And so now that it's over, the people who had fled in fear are now returning because it's safe. It says, when he needed them most, they had made off. Now they were ashamed and came behind shields in their battle outfits to where the old man lay. They watched Wiglaf sitting, worn out, a comrade shoulder to shoulder with his lord, trying in vain to bring him round with water. Much as he wanted to, there was no way he could preserve his lord's life on earth or alter in the least the Almighty's will. All right. And then he gives them a stern rebuke. All right. He speaks to them, and he says on the bottom of page 193, about 4 lines up, it says, Beowulf had little cause to brag about his armed guard, yet God, who ordains, who wins or loses, allowed him to strike with his own blade when bravery was needed. You see then, on page 193, it says a stern rebuke. All right, so Wiglaf is going to give these cowards who have just returned, he's going to give them a piece of his mind. All right, on the top of page 195 it says, I could do little to protect his life in the heat of the fray, yet I found new strength welling up when I went to help him. Then my sword connected in the deadly assaults of our foe grew weaker. The fire coursed less strongly from his head. But when the worst happened, too few rallied around the prince. Too few because I was the only one who did. All right. And then he goes down the last 2 lines of the section under that, about line 2890. He says, a warrior would sooner die than live a life of shame. So essentially he's calling those other people anything but warriors. You're no warriors. You're living a life of shame. All right. Line 2900 says, now the people's pride and love, the Lord of the Geats, is laid on his deathbed. Brought down by the dragon's attack, beside him lies the bane of his life, dead from knife wounds. So what we see here, I think it's an interesting thing to imagine. Beowulf lying dead on the ground, with a dragon lying dead on the ground right next to him. The two having murdered one another. And it's interesting because at the outset of this battle between the dragon and Beowulf, that word, I think, that was so brilliant of Heaney to use here in his translation that, Beowulf was ignited, and that put the dragon and Beowulf on the same level. Now they're dead, they're on the same level too, one right next to each other. So they began as equally matched adversaries and ended as equally matched adversaries. I think that's a pretty interesting thing, all right? If we want to go to page 197, all right, that first break there, it says, this is Wiglaf speaking here, and he's thinking about all the things now to come that Beowulf is gone. If you remember, Beowulf said, no other king would step up because they feared me. Well, there is no Beowulf anymore. So listen to what Wiglaf says here. He says, now war is looming over our nation. Soon it will be known to Franks and Frisians far and wide that the king is gone. Hostility has been great among the Franks since Heilac sailed forth at the head of a war fleet to Friesland. And he goes on and mentions 3 possible attacks from 3 groups of people who have just been waiting all this time to attack, but they haven't had the chutzpah to go forth and do it because Beowulf was their leader. And so he's saying, look, guys, we don't have him anymore. And you all have just proven yourselves to be a bunch of cowards. What's going to happen to us? All right. So, page 201, the last 2 lines of 201. He says, so this bad blood between us and the Swedes, okay, Geatland now is a different, this period is different than what is now the entirety of Sweden. Geatland is the southern tip of what we call Sweden now. But he says, this bad blood between us and the Swedes, this vicious feud, I'm convinced, is bound to revive. They will cross our borders and attack in force when they find out that Beowulf is dead. In days gone by, when our warriors fell and we were undefended, he kept our coffers and our kingdom safe. He worked for the people, but as well as that, he behaved like a hero. All right? And so he goes on to say, without him, it says here in the margins, it says, with Beowulf gone, a tragic future awaits. All right. So line 3021, there's something interesting here, an image here that sort of follows up on something I mentioned earlier. And I think it's interesting how this sort of bookends the tale here. It says, many a spear, dawn cold to the touch, will be taken down and waved on high. The swept heart won't waken the warriors, but the raven, winging darkly over the doomed, will have news, tidings for the eagle of how he hoked and ate, how the wolf and he made short work of the dead. If you remember, after Beowulf had done the good deeds for Hrothgar and Denmark, it said the raven announced the dawn. And I was mentioning in the video how that's so interesting because we usually associate ravens with darkness and brooding and evil omens and things like that. But Beowulf had done such a job that it sort of turned that association with the raven into something else. The raven was now bringing in the light. But we see here now the raven is back to being the dark and ominous creature that it normally is. I find that to be a fascinating detail in there. All right? About 4 lines down on page 205, it says, the great man had breathed his last. Beowulf the king had indeed met with a marvelous death. On page 209, we see a little bit of insight into Beowulf's funeral. 3110, line 3110. Then Whaleston's son, that's Wiglaf, stalwart to the end, had orders given to owners of dwellings, many people of importance in the land, to fetch wood from far and wide for the good man's pyre. Now shall flame consume our leader in battle, the blaze darken around him who stood his ground in the steel hall, when the arrow storm shot from bowstrings pelted the shield wall. The shaft hit home, feather-fledged, it finned the barb in flight. And it goes on here on page 211, about line, let's say 31, 36. We see Beowulf's funeral. It says, the great people built a pyre for Beowulf, stacked and decked it until it stood foursquare, hung with helmets, heavy war shields, and shining armor, just as he had ordered. Then his warriors laid him in the middle of it, mourning a lord, far famed and beloved. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down, and flames wrought havoc on the hot bone house, burning it to the core. The bone house being his body, burned it to the core. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. A Geat woman, too, sang out of grief. With her hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears. A wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. And so now we find that there is Beowulf's barrow, as they said, out on Hronesness, where sailors can see and mention, oh, this was Beowulf. Line 31, 69. Then 12 warriors rode around the tomb, chieftains' sons, champions in battle, all of them distraught, chanting in dirges, mourning his loss as a man and king. They extolled his heroic nature and exploits, and gave thanks for his greatness, which was the proper thing. For a man should praise a prince from whom he holds dear, and cherish his memory when that moment comes, when he has to be convoyed from his bodily home. So the Geat people, his hearth companions, sorrowed for the Lord who had been laid low. They said that of all the kings upon the earth, he was the man most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame. That's Beowulf. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you got something out of this. Stay tuned. I believe the next thing that I will be taking a look at is Hamlet. So we'll see how that goes, all right? So until then, and as always, everyone, I want to wish you happy reading.